Well, we're at the George Washington Birthplace National Monument. It's located here in Westmoreland County, Virginia. And the story of this, the Washington family plantation, can be told like any good story, probably in three main parts. The first part relates to the activities of the early Washingtons who lived here during the late 17th and early 18th centuries, a period that covered about 115 years. And during that time, the plantation here between Bridges Creek, which is right behind me, and Pope's Creek grew, and members of the Washington family, one after the other, became really prosperous planters and acquired large land holdings and attained important civic and political offices, not only in their local county, but also in the Virginia colony as a whole. The first period ends during the American Revolution when George Washington's home here accidentally catches fire and burns to the ground and is never rebuilt. The second main part of the story here spans about 100 years to a century when this entire site was neglected and all but forgotten by a growing nation that was really too preoccupied to preserve the birthplace of the first president. The foundation of the burned home was covered with brambles and thickets for so long that no one really knew the exact location and function of many of the plantation buildings here. And the final part of this story is the reconstruction and preservation of this place that would become known as Wakefield Plantation. But within each of these parts, of course, are the people who inhabited them. The characters of this story and the circumstances of their lives here are in many ways the very same circumstances of George Washington's life as a younger man. They're what shaped the man who would later become the leader of the American Revolution and our first president. Now, no doubt, when you really delve into it all, it's a really complex story. So we're going to try to simplify it for you, not by omitting any of the important details, but by splitting it up into several different short programs to make it easier to understand and hopefully easier to digest as well. So the first part of the George Washington story covers the 17th century and two of his really significant influences. They were indirect influences for him because he never physically knew them. The first was his great-grandfather, and the second was his grandfather, Lawrence Washington. And this is really the great benefit of coming here, because we get to travel back in time and meet a 24-year-old English tobacco trader named John Washington, the son of the Reverend Lawrence Washington. John Washington would eventually become the great-grandfather of George Washington. In the winter of 1657, he was a mate of the Ketch Seahorse of London. It's a merchant ship that ends up sinking in a storm right down on the Potomac River near where we're standing today, and would later be called Colonial Beach. When the rest of the crew is finally heading back to England, John has a disagreement with the owner and the captain of the ship, Edward Prescott, and he decides to remain in Virginia. But an even more compelling reason is that Washington meets Nathaniel Pope. And then he meets Pope's daughter, Anne, and that settles it. He wasn't going to go back. In 1659, a few years after his arrival here in Virginia, John marries Anne Pope and was given land on Maddox Creek by his father-in-law, Colonel Nathaniel Pope. On December 3rd, 1664, John Washington purchased 100 acres on the east side of Bridges Creek from David Anderson, along with several outbuildings and a family cemetery. It's right here that he and Anne create their second home, known as Bridges Creek Plantation. It's the first tract of land that's acquired by Washington on what today is designated as the George Washington Birthplace National Monument. Here, their first son, Lawrence, who's George's grandfather, was born in September of 1659 and quickly joined the other important men of his community. And then that same year, he was appointed coroner, and in 1662, he was made justice of the Westmoreland County Court. In 1664, a very distinct honor was given to him when the name of Appomattox County Parish in Westmoreland County was changed to Washington Parish, the one that it bears today. John and his family continued to live here, and they continued to do very well, developing the Tidewater plantation and carrying out a lot of important duties for both King and for the colony. About 1672, John was commissioned a lieutenant colonel in the county militia here, and in 1675 was directed to raise troops to conduct a campaign against the Doeg Indians in Maryland, who had made forays here into Virginia and had murdered 3 colonists. On at least 2 occasions, John represented his county in the Virginia House of Burgesses and attended its sessions in Jamestown, the capital city of the colony. In 1676, he actively supported Royal Governor William Berkeley against the rebellious Nathaniel Bacon and his followers, and was later awarded 9,950 pounds of tobacco for his part in raising forces to aid in suppressing the rebellion. By importing servants whose land had rights he could claim by purchase, by original patent, and by taking up grants of deserted land, John yearly added to his holdings and ultimately owned several thousand acres of land in Tidewater, Virginia, a colonial tobacco plantation. One of those properties on the Potomac would later become known as Mount Vernon. John died in 1677 and was buried in the family cemetery at Bridges Creek, about 1¼ miles northwest of the site where his illustrious great-grandson George was born 55 years later, and that's just down the road. It's closed, so we won't be able to access it, but we'll show you some photos of that. Now, Lawrence Washington was 5 years old when his parents moved from Maddox Creek to Bridges Creek Plantation. Except for a few months when he may have attended grammar school in England, he lived at Bridges Creek until early manhood. He was 18 when his father, John Washington, died. Being the eldest son, he inherited the largest share of the land. He became a recognized man of means and culture and ability, and he was very highly regarded. He was given the highest political offices here in Westmoreland County. Following his father's footsteps, he served as Justice of the Court of Westmoreland County as an officer in the county militia. He was later elected to the House of Burgesses when he was only 25 years old, serving 4 terms as a Burgess in the Colonial Assembly at Jamestown. Another position he held for several years was Sheriff of Westmoreland County. In 1690, Lawrence married Mildred Warner of Gloucester County, Virginia. She was the daughter of a prominent planter named Augustine Warner, who at one time had been Speaker of the House of Burgesses and a member of the Governor's Council. Lawrence died at the age of 38 in February of 1698 and was interred at the family cemetery on Bridges Creek. So certainly Lawrence was another indirect influence for George Washington. So think about the precedents each of these men set for George Washington. They were plantation owners, elected representatives, land speculators, and in the case of John Washington, he had military service as well. George Washington would have those traits in common with both men. In every way, these were the echoes of George Washington's past.